Hello and welcome to another video in my Fundamentals of Orchestration series. So far I've discussed both the string section and woodwind section of the orchestra in detail, and I'll be covering brass and percussion instruments very soon. But today I want to explore ways of combining strings and woodwinds, and I'll be arranging several short piano excerpts that I've composed for the combination of the two sections. I'll be using sample libraries from Orchestral Tools to help realize each example. Because I've spent quite a bit of time discussing strings and winds in previous videos, I want to dive into examples right away. I'll discuss my thoughts on each example and orchestration, including why I chose certain combination of instruments and how to balance the sections. Let's get started. In the first example, I wanted to bring back an example from my last video from piano to winds, so that I could talk about differences in the wind version versus a wind and string version. First, here's the solo piano version. And just for reference, here's the first version of that winds-only orchestration from the previous video. So in that version, I gave the melody to a solo oboe and split the left-hand piano material between bassoons and a clarinet. So now let's think about how to instead make a version for strings and winds together. There's a few things to consider here. One important question to ask is, what is the relationship between the two sections? For instance, you could start by orchestrating this for the string section, which would be easy enough. Here I've given the melody to the first violins, then split up the left-hand piano material like I did in that wind-only version. So the second bassoon part is now basses, the first bassoon part is now cello, and the clarinet part is now viola. I also added a second violin part, which helps bridge the gap in registers between melody and accompaniment. I'll play just the strings alone here. Overall, it's very similar to the wind version, so one option would be to simply color this string orchestration with wind doublings. I'll essentially add back in that same wind arrangement with bassoons, clarinets, and oboes on the melody. Then, to make the overall sound a bit lighter, I think I'll make the basses pizzicato instead of bowed. The second bassoon will still sustain the bass notes through the measure, so I can safely have the basses just to reinforce the sonority on the downbeat with pizzicatos. Putting these together, here's a very simple version of winds and strings on this excerpt. The strings still dominate the overall texture, but the winds add a bit of color, they highlight the individual lines within the texture, and in particular the oboes add a bit of clarity to the melody. The winds blend nicely into the texture, and because I'm doubling the lines at the same octave, they don't stand out. If you instead want them to stand out, you'd need to adjust dynamics of both winds and strings, or move the wind instruments into a different register, or do some combination of both. Let's look at one other version for this example. If you recall from the piano to winds video, I made another version of that same excerpt. Here it is. The flutes up the octave provide more melodic support, and the clarinets moved up in register help to thicken the texture overall. We can take this same concept and add strings by doubling each part. I'll double the melody with first violins, although I chose to keep it just in the lower octave, considering the dynamic marking of piano for this music. This will allow the flutes to stand out just a bit. I'll double the clarinets with second violins, the English horn with viola, and the bassoons with cello and basses, with cello divided in two. Compared to the first version, this version will be more full, richer, and more focused on the melody, given the doubling up the octave in flutes. I make sure to keep each wind instrument in a comfortable register and stick to idiomatic writing. The result is a nicely blended, rich, and colorful orchestral sound. I want to look at another excerpt from a previous video, this time from Piano to Strings. Here's the piano version. And here's what I did with just strings. The goal here was a full, powerful sound on beats 1 and 4, and contrasting subito piano pizzicatos on beats 2. Here's what that sounded like. I can add winds to this, but in order for them to really add anything to the texture, or to be heard at all, I need to think carefully about register. I definitely want piccolo in its high register, alongside flutes in a high register and clarinets up there as well. Even though oboes aren't necessarily as loud in the high register, I'll still place them relatively high because otherwise the middle register string texture will overpower them entirely. On the low end, I'll want bassoons and contrabassoon down on the roots of the chords, so here's what that sounds like. Another approach would be to use the winds only in the contrasting beat 2 chords. I'll lower the dynamic marking and bring the winds closer to the middle register so that you really hear the difference between beat 1 and beat 2 in each measure. Here's what that might sound like. Moving on to example 3, this is a new example, not one from a previous video. Here we have an aggressive melodic motive in octaves. The piano version sounds like this. If we stick to just the instruments that would provide the necessary power in just those 2 octaves, then we might have something like this. Here we have cello, basses, bass clarinet, 2 bassoons, and contrabassoon. It might make sense to allow for an additional higher octave, which would let us use the upper strings as well as clarinets and English horn. The violas and violins add an extra level of power, especially with the violins taking advantage of their aggressive and powerful low timbre on the G string. I could of course expand to yet another high octave, which would let me use flutes and oboes. Because flutes and oboes alone don't provide enough power in this register to warrant the addition, I'll move the first violins up the octave to join them. You could continue to go higher and eventually add piccolo many octaves above the original piano notes. But you should ask yourself, what was the goal of the original piano part? Because you ultimately want to maintain the aesthetic integrity of the original, and perhaps extending too far into the upper register would take away from that original concept. Let's move on to another example. It's a simple triplet melody over an 8th note staccato accompaniment in B-flat major. The first question would be, what instruments get the melody and what instruments get the accompaniment? Do you separate these roles by section, perhaps strings on the melody and winds on the accompaniment, or vice versa? Or do you mix roles among the sections? Mixing roles is always the more challenging choice and can be extremely rewarding, but it's not always the best choice. Let's listen to the piano version first. For the first version, I decided to give the music primarily to Woodwinds, with the melody on a solo oboe, as it's in a nice range for the playful style of music. Clarinet would work as well, and flute would work too, although the flute won't be as prominent in this range. The only string part in this version is the steady 8th note B-flat in violas, using a staccato bowing. Notice I doubled the B-flat up the octave in the second flutes for the 3rd, 5th, and 6th measures. Often when orchestrating, you can safely add inner voices that fit the harmony, and in this case I liked having 2 flutes together near the oboe range, as they contribute to the overall playful sound. Here's what this sounds like. So that version featured a solo instrument on the melody, but we could also try having several instruments in unison. In this version, I have the melody in 2 flutes and 2 oboes. In this range, the oboes will be louder than flutes, but the 2 flutes will definitely contribute to the timbre that I want, in this case, playful and lively. To balance the more prominent melody, I added an extra bassoon and later English horn, as well as more strings, albeit on pizzicatos. This pizzicato texture will fit nicely into the background and will help punctuate the rhythm and notes, without creating too dense a texture. The violas are still on the steady B-flat eighth notes, but I added the cello on just the downbeats to create a better sense of meter and pulse. Let's give this a listen. Both of those versions were relatively light in texture and overall sound. Perhaps we want something a bit bigger, while still maintaining the playful quality. So to make a texture bigger, we could add more instruments, we could increase the dynamics, or we could expand the range of the instruments, for instance, move flutes up the octave, in this case to a stronger register. But to maintain the playful character, I'll keep the dynamics marked the same. I will in fact add more instruments. I'll give the melody to 2 flutes up the octave, 2 clarinets at the original octave, as well as first violins. In order to balance the melody, I'll add more strings on the accompaniment as well. Instead of pizzicato, I'll give the strings short bowed articulations, although I'll keep the basses on pizzicato. I could move the first violins up the octave, but if I want more of that lighter, folk-like sound, I want to keep them in their middle register. You'll also notice that I adjusted the background rhythms to further achieve the desired aesthetic. For instance, the celli now have occasional triplet rhythms. Let's hear this version. Moving on, here's another example, and although I haven't used this in a previous video, the basic construction of the piano texture is similar to previous examples in those videos. The right hand has the melody and some harmonic supporting notes, while the left hand has an arpeggiated eighth note pattern that outlines the chord and adds motion. Let's listen to the piano version. Notice that there are no pedal markings, so you might decide that hearing each distinct eighth note without much of a sustain is important here. In this version, I wanted to emphasize the unconnected eighth note texture in the accompaniment, so I gave the cello and violas staccato eighth notes and the basses pizzicatos. I could have also given the second violins that same staccato eighth note texture, but I chose to align them more rhythmically with the first violins on the melody. Still, you'll see that there are no sustaining half or dotted half notes in any of the instruments. I'm doubling the melody with oboes, and the rest of the woodwinds have pulsating eighth notes. I haven't really expanded the range up or down, although the basses do have a few notes down the octave. Here's what this sounds like. If you don't want to emphasize the unconnected eighth note idea, then having sustained notes would be perfectly fine. In this version, I give the melody to a solo flute, solo oboe, and solo bassoon, each in their own octave. The only sense of an eighth note pulse is in the violas, with cello and violins sustaining the chords, and basses punctuating the roots with pizzicatos. Overall, there will be a lot less motion, and because the accompaniment is less active, the listener will focus more on the melody. The last version for this example shows an expanded range both up and down. I've doubled the low part down the octave in basses and doubled the oboe melody in flutes up the octave, with first violins divided in half in octaves. The eighth note texture is now split between clarinets, English horn, and violas, with second violins on portatos above the violas. Even though the dynamics are marked piano, the overall sound will be more full because of the number of instruments and where those instruments sit in their respective registers. The next example demonstrates a very pianistic texture of arpeggiated quintuplets. Here's what that sounds like. If I had a full orchestra at my disposal, I would want to keep this texture in piano and perhaps add sustaining strings or winds. Or perhaps instead of piano, I could choose another keyboard instrument, or harp, or a mallet percussion instrument. But with just strings and winds, we have to be very careful about orchestrating this texture. From my own personal experience working with orchestras, and also playing in large ensembles, I know that giving the instruments arpeggios like this is hard enough, not to mention quintuplets. Any odd rhythmic pattern like groups of 5 or 7 will be especially difficult for any instrument other than the ones I mentioned, and splitting this gesture up would be equally ineffective. Asking an instrumentalist to start a gesture on the 5th quintuplet or something similar would be simply too difficult. It's much smarter to try and maintain the overall effect, but to simplify the rhythms. In this version, I've given the motion to the clarinets in the form of trills, and I've extracted a melodic gesture from the top note of each group of quintuplets from the piano version. I shifted those notes over to the downbeat as it will be much more effective in an orchestra. I wanted to make these quarter notes extremely connected, so I split the phrase up between pairs of woodwinds to allow for breathing. Here's what it sounds like. In the next version, I got rid of the quarter note melodic pattern and replaced it with sustaining flute and clarinet notes, the crescendo and diminuendo back and forth. The accompaniment is now split up between trilling, flute 2 and clarinet 2, as well as muted violin measured trills, and sustaining viola and cello harmonics. The harmonics provide a bit of that glassy, fragile texture that I think the piano does really well, and the muted strings add a unique timbral color underneath the clarinet and flute solos. If you really want to capture the motion from the original piano, you'll have difficulty doing that just in strings and winds, and the instruments I mentioned before, like harp, celeste, or marimba, or just even piano, would still work better. Moving on, here is an example that in some ways is similar to that previous one, in that there's a repeating pattern with irregular temporal divisions, in this case eighth notes within a 7/8 meter. Fortunately, eighth notes are a lot easier to play than quintuplets, and I think this example will translate more easily to orchestra. Here's the piano version first. For the first version, I decided to split the gesture into 3 groups. If the pattern was constantly changing, I would caution against giving instruments syncopated or offbeat eighth notes, but because this pattern repeats just about every measure, it's not asking the players too much to learn these rhythms. There are countless examples of similar textures throughout works by Stravinsky, Prokofiev, and many others, so the 3 groups in this version are the flutes, oboes, and violins on the top notes, the celli, bassoons, and bass clarinet on the bottom notes, and violas, clarinets, and English horn on the middle notes. I chose to make the strings pizzicato, although staccatos would work well here too. Obviously, with that example, you don't get any sense of sustain, and it's especially noticeable in measures 4 and 8. I sort of like the pause between phrases, however, so I think that would work. But in the next version, I keep the winds the same, but sustain the strings using sol tasto bowing. It creates an interesting background for this 7/8 texture in the winds. The next example demonstrates a late Romantic era, or perhaps classic film score style melody, and harmonic progression in E major. Unlike some of the previous examples in this video, the dynamics are marked forte here, so we'll want a much fuller and richer orchestration. Here's the piano version. I want to show two different orchestrations for this example. The first is basically copying and pasting the notes and rhythms in their original octave into the strings and winds. I gave the melody to flutes, oboes, English horn, and violins. The clarinets fill in the notes between the octaves of the melody, and the left-hand piano arpeggio is split up between bassoons, bass clarinet, violas, celli, and basses. Sustaining the notes of this arpeggio between instruments provides a rich harmonic texture. Here's what this sounds like. So I think that orchestration is fine, but not very exciting. To me, this moment deserves more from the orchestra, and that may involve adding notes and rhythms that aren't in the original piano version. In the second version, I've doubled the melody up the octave in first violins and piccolo, and added flute and clarinet ascending runs to the downbeat of each measure, using notes of the scales that fit each chord. I've expanded the range downward as well with contrabassoons and basses in the lowest octave. The celli and violas are also more active, with the top half of the divisi celli on the melody. So now the melody spans 3 octaves and the accompaniment is very full, encompassing the entire range of the sections. Let's give this a listen. The next example is just a bit longer, and there are sort of 2 distinct sections in this one, the first 4 measures and then the last 2. This could provide an opportunity to try and evolve an orchestral texture over time. Up until this point, the examples have demonstrated a single texture, whether it's a composite texture or not, but one that doesn't change or evolve over time. When you're working with actual pieces of music, you'll probably want to think about how your music changes over time, and orchestration can play a big role in that. Let's give this piano version a listen, and you'll notice I play a bit with the tempo on this one, as the accelerating and decelerating really adds to the music. In this first version, I have the winds carrying the melody, which I extracted from the top notes of the right hand of the piano. The harmony is filled in the upper register by violin tremolos, and in the low end by bassoons, contrabassoon, celli, and basses. The texture evolves just a bit in measure 5, with the violins joining the flutes and clarinets on a partial doubling of the melody. The rest of the strings become more active here, and the overall motion in the texture is created by moving eighth notes as opposed to tremolos. Let's give this a listen. I made a second version of this that's very similar, but the entire string section is now using tremolo saltasto bowing, and the first violins are doubling the melody more prominently throughout. The next example is stylistically quite different and uses jazz voicings and chords underneath a simple melody. Here's the piano version. For this first version, I've given the melody to first violins, flutes, and first oboe, with second violins and second oboe on the right-hand supporting material. I've split up the left-hand arpeggiated material into several instruments with clarinets, bassoons, violas, celli, and pizzicato basses. The bass pizzicatos help to fit the jazz style, but I've doubled the bass notes with divisi celli and second bassoons for support. In measure 2, the clarinets take over the melody from the oboes and flutes as the notes move down into a lower range. Let's give this a listen. In the next version, I expand the range up by doubling the melody up the octave in the first flute, so now the melody is in flutes and first oboe. The first violins, second oboe, and English horn share that secondary material that harmonizes underneath the melody, and the rest of the winds and strings are just sustaining half notes. The first violin material ascends into the second half of measure 1 before joining in on the melody in measure 2. Other than the melody, the motion of eighth notes, which was originally in the left hand of the piano, is now found solely in the bass pizzicatos. I've also added a 16th note figure in beat 4 of measure 1 in the basses that pushes us into measure 2. Here's what this sounds like. I have just 2 more examples for this video, and both are a bit longer, so I've only made one version for each. The first one is actually from a melody in the oboe introduction video, and I used it again in the wind melody video. I've now added harmonies and an accompaniment to this melody, and stylistically speaking, I was kind of aiming for a Bernard Herrmann sound. To do that, I used quite a bit of extended harmonies as well as augmented triads. Here's what that sounds like in the piano. Of all the examples in this video, I probably spent the most time working on this one. I used the combination of bassoons and piccolo on the melody. It's that same pairing from the woodwind melody video a few weeks ago. The accompaniment starts out in winds with clarinets and flutes harmonizing the melody with static sustains. The strings then enter quietly and the texture slowly evolves until measure 8 when the string section is at its strongest. I tried to build a sense of direction in the strings music so that they start out relatively quiet and low in register, and then expand in dynamics and register. The winds, meanwhile, are sort of working in the opposite direction as the overall wind texture moves down with the melody. What starts out as a texture dominated by winds evolves into a much fuller string and wind timbre. Let's give this a listen. Because the score and MIDI data are much larger, I'll play this music twice, first with the score in view, and then with the MIDI data. The last example today is from music that I've used quite a bit, most recently in the Orchestrating a Melody for Woodwinds video, but also several times before. Here's a few measures of an arrangement of the melody to Poor Wayfaring Stranger. I'll play the piano version first. I kept it very simple here, as sometimes simplicity is just as good. I gave the melody to an English horn solo with string accompaniment. By leaving the orchestration simple, it allows the listener to focus more on the soloist and the rich harmonies underneath, and to not get distracted by middle ground or background gestures and textures. Here it is. So that does it for this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'll be looking at the brass section next, and then percussion after that. As always, click the like button and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'd really appreciate it. See you next time.